Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Battle in the Dark, Inside the Identity Fraud Gap. My name is Pinar Alpay. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Signicat, and it's great to have so many of you joining us today. Before we dive into today's agenda, I'd like to introduce Lisa Forte, partner at Red Goat Cybersecurity. Lisa is an internationally recognized cybersecurity expert with extensive experience in crisis management and incident response. She has helped major organizations strengthen their defenses and rehearse for potential attacks. She has contributed her expertise to Battle in the Dark research that we are presenting today, and I know her insights will add real value to our discussion. Thank you for joining us, Lisa.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. So before we begin, a small note. You can send in your questions at any time during the session using the Q&A box on the right-hand side. And we'll have time at the end to answer as many as we can. Now, let me give you a quick overview of what we will be covering today. We will begin by looking at some of the key findings from the Battle in the Dark report. Then we'll hear from Lisa, who will take us through the current fraud landscape, the main tactics we're seeing, and how criminals are adapting. Following this, we will talk about where fraud enters the customer journey and why layered defenses are so important. Lisa and I will then have a joint discussion on business readiness, including regulation and the balance between security and customer experience. And finally, we will open up for Q&A session to answer your questions. You can write your question anytime during the session. Okay, now let me share a bit about the research behind the Battle in the Dark report. What we have done is we have interviewed 900 fraud decision makers across 9 different countries in Europe: Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. These interviews spanned 5 industries: banking, payments, and fintech, insurance, gaming, and mobility. So we are going to be today presenting the aggregate results, but in the report you will see all of this data sliced and diced into different countries or the industries. What we've also done is we've analyzed Signicat's own fraud detection data from our Video ID fraud product. That gave us valuable additional perspective on the kinds of fraud we see happening today on the ground, fighting fraud day in, day out. So together, this gives us a comprehensive view on how fraud is developing, how it's evolving, which tactics are most common, which ones are the costliest to businesses, which tactics are emerging, and where businesses are struggling to keep up. Now, let's move on to the key findings from the report. One of the clearest findings in the report is the gap between confidence and reality. 59% of businesses reported an increase in successful identity fraud in the last year. In banks, this number is as high as 64%. And what we also see is 1 in 5 transactions and customer onboardings being fraudulent. This is reported by the participants of the study. Yet, if we look at, if we ask the respondents whether they believe they are winning the battle against fraud, 74% believe that they are. How can this both be true? The answer lies in the visibility. Less than half of businesses actually measure the impact of fraud on their organization. And without measurement, confidence is based on perception rather than on data. Businesses don't really know for sure the impact of fraud and where on the customer journey they are most vulnerable and what part of the ecosystem is most targeted. And this is why we have called our report Battle in the Dark, because we are fighting an ever-evolving fraud landscape us as service providers, but also our customers. But we actually don't have enough data to know where we are most vulnerable. If we and this is really costing companies. The financial impact of fraud is not small. Businesses estimate that fraud and the cost of preventing it, including, for example, all the technology, all the sort of money they have to spend on technology, all the fraud losses, the processes they have to put in place to prevent fraud, it is costing them about 22% of annual revenue. So what we see here is a pattern of rising fraud, high confidence, but limited evidence. And this combination creates a dangerous blind spot. And to really understand why this gap exists, we need to look at the fraud landscape itself, how criminals are operating and how tactics are shifting. Lisa, let me hand it over to you to take us through what the data reveals.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I think I want to start just by setting the scene with regards to fraud and just cast your mind back, even just to say 2010. If we look at back then, we were probably largely looking at like card scamming, cloning, that kind of thing. Then we moved more into sort of tools that were built for mobile devices. And now we're looking kind of at AI and the sort of thing that brings in. And I think the key thing to really understand here is it's gone from those sorts of almost nuisance type behaviors through to something that's now highly organized, highly sophisticated, and those opportunistic criminals are no longer the biggest concern. We're talking about sophisticated, scalable businesses almost that are thriving off of fraud and are sort of driving actually innovation to some degree within the fraud sector. And I think, we've had things from the report, for example, fraud attempts up by 88% over the last 4 years, for example, and identity fraud attempts in particular. I'm just reading from the data that are up 69%. So it's not a blip. This is a sort of seismic shift almost. And as we go through this and we look at the threat landscape, I think we have to appreciate a couple of things. I think we have to appreciate how organized they are, how they can deploy our tools against us as well, for their own gain. And I think the other thing that they are particularly good at, unfortunately, is actually exploiting gaps that we have. One of the conversations I was having recently with someone, we were talking about, if you look at how sort of typical businesses work on our side of the fight, we kind of have AML compliance, we'll have cybersecurity teams, we'll have fraud teams, and largely, in my experience anyway, those teams work sort of in silos. They're not really collaborating, and what that does is it actually causes gaps within the organization. And the criminals don't think like that. They don't have this sort of siloed behavior when they're working. I used to work in UK police law enforcement in the cybercrime unit, and you just don't see criminals in this area working like that. And what happens is we create gaps that are then exploitable. So I think if we look at the most common identity fraud tactics that we're seeing, identity document forgery, again, low cost, ease of execution, and now AI has kind of supercharged that, I think, from a kind of from both a barrier to entry point perspective, which is now incredibly low, all the way up through to sort of the ability to sort of execute it. And I know we'll talk more about AI in a bit as well. Then we also have sort of account takeover, very costly for businesses, targeting customers, much harder to detect often as well, and social engineering. And the last one, I think, is kind of really important, because across cybercrime and fraud, social engineering is still one of the most powerful ways of compromising anything, really, whether we're talking about ransomware attacks that have taken down sort of big companies like that we've seen recently, both in the UK and in the US, or if we're talking about fraud, it's the same thing. The human element of that chain is quite easy sometimes to exploit, and social engineering tactics are highly effective, and they're also really cost effective as well. So you can see people, for example, I was at a conference the other day, and they were talking about fraud, and they were talking about how they'd actually seen people who had been manipulated over a longer period of time in order to hand over their identity and their accounts to the fraudsters under some misguided belief. And we see this time and time again outside of the business context as well, with sort of romance fraud and other things like that, all of which use social engineering. It all uses this human manipulation. But AI is a massive part of this now, unfortunately. The report highlighted, I think 71% of respondents stated that AI was being used to conduct fraud. And if you think about AI, I think my perspective on this is very much that the jury is a little bit out on whether AI will be more useful for offense or defense. So we're not quite sure yet which side of the fence it's going to be the most useful for. However, one thing that we are seeing in the fraud landscape, for example, is fraudsters now have the ability that they never had before. They have the ability to buy, for example, a custom version of some sort of GPT tool like Fraud GPT or something like that. And they basically buy a tool stack that they can use. They can then use that to build websites, to build scripts, etc. And then you can basically deploy that to a 5,000 plus call center of staff that you have located, you know, somewhere in the world where we have these unfortunate kind of scaled, enslaved centers for people doing these fraud attacks. And then you can basically go for it and you can just deploy this. And what that does is it makes the barrier to entry really low. And the problem that that creates into and of itself is that we get this situation where actually it's really easy for someone to create a fake identity. It's really easy for someone to create fake identity documents. It's really easy for them to deploy scripts at scale, target everybody from the most vulnerable to, you know, the most wealthy people in our society. And then on the other side of the fence, we're trying to compete at the same speed for detection purposes. So it does make it incredibly challenging. And one of the examples I want to just quickly give of how we've got to sort of adapt our thinking a little bit. So many of you will know that in the UK really recently, we had the Online Safety Act come in. It received widespread criticism across the cybercrime and fraud communities. But that aside, the situation with it was all of a sudden you had to provide identity proof to access certain websites. And the rationale behind it, we don't need to go into, but essentially what people were doing in the UK was downloading or generating driving licenses for Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, or their local MP, and then uploading that. So the name didn't match, nothing matched, everything was totally ridiculous. And it basically was the situation. It made a mockery, really, of this request for identity documentation. But I think it does show that unless all of your points are linked up and serve that purpose, all that you end up doing is just you're doing something that just basically has no effect whatsoever. And this was a great example of that, because people again were just bypassing the identity verification requirement that allegedly was supposed to be safeguarding a group of people. And it was just basically for nothing, because everyone was uploading Sir Keir Starmer's driving license, which, whilst hilarious, kind of defeats the entire point of all of the legislation and the cost that went into implementing the Online Safety Act. So I think we need to also look at the sort of top fraud tactics by sector. And actually the report was quite interesting from my perspective for this, because it did sort of shift a little bit between sort of different industries, more so than others. And I think I won't go through all of the data that you can kind of see up on your screen here, but I think what's quite interesting is that there's a difference between sectors, but there's also a bit of a difference between countries as well. However, the kind of broad consensus is that essentially fraudsters are exploiting industry specific vulnerabilities for sure. They've got that data and intelligence. Cyber criminals and fraudsters are very data driven actually, which feeds into the problem that we have generally with all of this. And I think also the other thing that's really interesting is like there's a cultural difference as well, perhaps in terms of how they socially engineer people as well. So I think we're seeing, you know, for example, you can see here the different types of percentages in different areas of what we're seeing. Social engineering being higher in some industries than others, and I think that's all quite interesting, especially when you go and read the report. Also, the sort of breakdown of how that kind of transpires across industries and countries was quite interesting as well. But again, I think it goes to show that we've just got to keep reminding ourselves that the fraudsters, the cyber criminals, the scammers, all of whom are running high driven for them. And we've seen this in the cybercrime world, particularly where they discuss the types of, for example, defensive capability per industry, where the vulnerabilities are per industry. This data is out there. This data is being discussed on the dark web. The one thing we know about the sort of dark world of online crime, be that fraud or be that cybercrime, is actually the nefarious actors are really, really good at sharing intelligence. And that's one thing I think we're kind of lacking in on our side, is this kind of data is stuff that we really need to be consuming and discussing. I think the other thing is there's the kind of human side of all this as well. So I think, you know, fraudsters targeting end customers first. Again, social engineering was one of the top 3 tactics, as we saw at the beginning. And again, it follows, therefore, that targeting the customers is actually, to use business language, it's a great return on investment for a lot of these fraudsters. And I think the report said something like 3 in 10 businesses said that their customers were the most successful targets for fraudsters, and then technology following that. And again, I think a lot of organizations are sort of playing catch up with this, and I think there is a general awareness within the community of fraud. I think a lot of people generally understand this a little bit more. But again, I think that there's a lot of sophistication building that lots of end customers, for example, won't necessarily be aware of in the same way that we are having this, you know, being on this webinar and being part of this sort of community. And the transaction stage was the most vulnerable point in the customer journey, which I think follows and kind of makes sense. I do think that the one problem that we really have, if we're seeing that 40%, which is a huge number, 40% is almost half of all the fraud happens at that transaction stage, which I think means a couple of things. Firstly, that's clearly where we need to concentrate our efforts. And secondly, I think the other issue that we have is we need, as a community, to be more proactive here. Because if we're seeing half of the fraud happen at the transaction stage, that's already hit our perimeter. That's already got to the point where it's hit our perimeter, and now we have to deal with it. We have to perhaps also look at being more proactive, going out, taking domains down, looking for things that are out there that are being used to facilitate fraud before we even get to this point of transaction where clearly, you like I said, it's sort of hit your perimeter at that point. And EIDs were also targeted too. A lot of people think EIDs are the answer. I won't sort of dive too much into the politics of it. There's a big sort of push happening here in the UK at the moment as well with this. I think EIDs, and the report does make this clear as well, I think EIDs in principle make online transactions safer. I think they help prevent fraud in principle, and I think they offer and afford a heightened degree of privacy in principle. However, there are, like every piece of technology and every innovation, there are issues with them. And obviously a shift over definitely shows fraudsters this is somewhere that we need to focus on. This is somewhere we need to innovate. And if we look at the most common forms of EID fraud, we've got account takeover, which is at the highest, pretty unexpected, I would say, synthetic identity fraud, and deep fakes. And deep fakes are sort of a new and concerning, what would I call it, threat that is emerging. So the rise of deep fakes. So AI, the report found 71% of businesses report that most of the fraud, identity fraud, now involves AI at some point. And I think the thing that sort of happened with deepfakes, which is quite interesting, is it allows a couple of things. It allows much better, I suppose, voice cloning, image cloning, image generation, I suppose, on some level as well, to happen. It can happen cheaply, and it can happen in a scalable way for the fraudsters. And that creates a big problem from our side of the fence. And if you can see the growth in this second box here from 2022 to 2024 is just quite incredible, actually. We're seeing significant growth year on year, and I think this year will be even worse again, because I think it's actually become even more accessible. And this is just the deep fake side of it. This is not even taking into account the GPT style, LLM style script generation and other things that can be used for social engineering and things like that. So I think we have an interesting challenge ahead of ourselves with all of this. And again, I think it comes back time and time again to we need to be proactive, because if we are reactive, we are always going to be sort of fighting a losing battle, so to speak. But I'm going to hand back to Pinar now to talk about mitigating identity fraud.
Thank you, Lisa, for the great insights. Let me, great. Thanks, Lisa, for the great insights. Understanding where fraud happens is only part of the challenge, but it's a very important part of the challenge. As Lisa said, knowing that our customers are targeted the most, knowing that fraud happens at the transaction stage. These are very important data that show us how to focus our efforts. The other part is visibility. It's difficult to fight what you cannot see. And today, many organizations still don't measure fraud consistently. As we sort of saw in the data before, only 45% of businesses measure fraud and its impact on their businesses consistently. And the lack of reporting reflects hides the true scale of the problem. Without that clarity, it's impossible to know where vulnerabilities lie and whether existing controls are effective. So improving measurement and reporting is essential. With reliable data, businesses can refine their fraud models and focus resources on where they will have the greatest impact. And of course, the second part of this is rethinking fraud models according to the data that we have, and focusing our efforts where it will matter the most. Because of course we don't have the unlimited resources, so it's important to focus the efforts where it will matter the most. When we ask businesses what fraud fighting methods they rely on the most, we actually found a whole range of different tactics that businesses use to fight fraud. But three stood out: profiling techniques such as mobile, email addresses, IP checks, stepping up security for higher risk transactions. So it makes total sense, and manual checks for transactions. Those are the top three that stood out. on what businesses use, what methods businesses use to detect fraud. But as you can see, there's a whole range of other methodology that businesses use. Ongoing monitoring of customer data to make sure that once you onboarded the customer, the data that you have on the customer is current. Robust identity verification methods such as machine learning fraud technology to fight fraud, AI fraud with AI, risk assessment of transactions. These are all really sort of important tactics that you can use. One of the things that came out from the report was that fraudsters are actually quite agile to adapt to our fraud prevention tactics. 79% majority of businesses feel that their efforts to push back against fraudsters doesn't deter them. They just change their tactics. 80% of the respondents said that the fraudsters will change their tactics and adapt to the fraud prevention methods that are used by businesses. But nevertheless, of course, doing all of these things or a combination of them makes total sense, and it protects the businesses. But how do we mitigate against fraud? There are 4 key things that we share with our customers at Signicat. The first one is to use a multi-layered approach. What that means is that one single method or one single tactic is not the silver bullet. Using a combination of technologies and techniques makes total sense, and using those combination of technologies in the right way, so that you can have the right balance between great user experience that's really smooth, allows the customers to onboard quickly and do their transactions quickly with the highest convenience, balancing that with the right level of security and the right level of friction that's introduced at the right time. That also balances the cost of preventing fraud. That is the key, and this of the right way to go. The second part is covering all the vulnerable fronts, from onboarding to login to payment authorizations and signatures, but focusing on the areas where we know we are most vulnerable. So if a business is measuring where the fraud happens, and if they find out that the transaction stage is the most important, or if it's the post-transaction, that's where we can actually sort of focus on covering the vulnerable fronts. The third important point is to battle AI with AI, right? There's as Lisa pointed out, and as it came out from our study, there's much more sophisticated tools that are now available with AI, that's at the disposal of fraudsters today. That's really widely available. It's cheap, and it's basically super sophisticated. To counter that, businesses need to use tools that also utilize machine learning technology, that uses massive data analysis, pattern recognition, predictive analytics capabilities, etc. And the third part is education. And what I'm referring to here is, of course, knowing that customers are the most vulnerable here, but also staff is also targeted, right? People are in most cases the weakest point. So education on educating the employees as well as customers on what they should be doing, what they should be looking out for, is an important part of mitigating identity fraud. Now I'm going to give a quick glimpse of how you would look at mitigating identity fraud with Signicat, and that probably gives us a good overview of how you can use the multiple tools that you have available from providers like Signicat to fight fraud. The first part of it here is the early risk assessments. right? Early risk assessment is all about, looking at, for example, things like behavioral analytics, geolocation, looking at whether, for example, an email address has just been bought, or a mobile phone has been just been bought, or they're looking at velocity checks, right? For example, has the same mobile phone been trying to onboard itself for 40 times? So early risk assessment is important to be able to flag whether a transaction is at high risk of being fraudulent. And this is really important for EID transactions as well, right? So, if an EID, for example, is Norwegian EID, but the access request is coming from somewhere in Brazil or Nigeria, that's a flag, and that's basically a flag for doing additional step ups in the security. The second part is verifying identities and authenticating users with robust methods. There are various robust methods, of course, that are available. For example, EIDs, right? Signicat has the largest EID hub in the world with additional risk data that's available, both from the EIDs as well as Signicat's own data. Reuse ID is another product that combines robust onboarding methodologies with authentication, various robust ID document and biometric verification checks. So, for example, Signicat's video ID, the data that you have seen previously, which is basically a video streaming based identity document and biometric verification product, as well as Read ID, which is NFC-based document verification, which completely eradicates document tampering fraud with basically reading the NFC chip that's available on the identity document with the mobile phone. That's available to pretty much everyone. And authentication methods such as mobile ID, which is PSD2 compliant passwordless login with geofencing and app shielding technology. The third part is, of course, once the identity data has been collated, being able to check that with trusted data sources. And Signicat has more than 200 trusted data sources that are connected to our platform for user checks, as well as AML compliance, as well as business checks, by the way. And then, when you're doing the actual transaction, signing documents, having qualified advanced electronic signatures that are really strong with trust services that actually back that up, as well as ongoing monitoring. This is super important to be able to detect any anomalies, because things change after onboarding. People change jobs, people change addresses, organizations go bankrupt or not. So it's very important to have accurate and current data on your users and your customers to be able to detect any anomalies that may be present. And using all of these tools in the right order, in ways that actually balance risk with additional stepped up security, is how you can basically use a multi-layered defense. And in this of course context, using orchestration tools such as Signicat's Mint, which is a no-code drag and drop onboarding flow builder, or Signicat's Risk Flow, which is a back-end orchestration product capable of very advanced logic, or Instant KYC, Instant KYB. These are off-the-shelf, compliantly built workflows that can be basically, very quickly implemented. Okay, so that's all we wanted to present on the the content, but some sort of maybe we will now move on to the Q&A part of the session, and let me see if there are any questions. But before we look at that, I think regulation is super important. Lisa, previously you were talking about the regulations in the UK that make it mandatory now to access some websites. You have to give your identity document. And the question is, in some cases, is regulation a barrier or an opportunity? We asked actually this question to our respondents in the survey, and 73% of respondents agree that regulation they need to adhere to hinders them rather than help them fight against fraud. Of course, when we're talking about fraudsters, they are actually free to do whatever they want. But when businesses are trying to fight against fraud, there's a whole bunch of regulation. Of course, it's important to regulate and make sure that some certain standards are adhered to. But what is your perspective on this?
I think it depends, which is the classic cybersecurity answer that you'll get from me. And I think it depends on two things, actually. I think it depends, one, on how the regulation itself is written, because I think it can very easily just turn into tick box, check box compliance, which achieves very little. And in fact, actually probably makes it easier for the fraudsters to predict how to bypass systems. The second side of it is what happens with the regulators. Regulators can be fantastic, and I've seen some regulators who have been incredibly helpful and incredibly understanding, but I've also seen some regulators cause a lot of issues, and that may be because they're overly interfering. So you see this in, for example, the cyber attack world, for example, DORA in the financial services world, where you've got to sort of report these things. If you have a situation where you have a regulator who is continuously asking you for updates when you've had a serious cyber attack, well, actually, no, at that moment in time, I need to focus on getting my business back online. And your continuous interference is causing a problem. It's not helping me. So I think the way the regulators respond to things and how they behave is also really, really critical for that. I think overall, in an ideal world, we wouldn't actually need regulation. And we would be able to collaborate in such a way that would be fast and adapt, because the other downside to regulation is it's generally slow. So by the time you've got it agreed, out, implemented in member states, in the EU at least, like largely, the kind of the threat landscape has sort of moved on. So I would say that generally speaking, it can be more of a barrier. Actually, I think we probably at a point where we do need that baseline, as you said, of what we need to do as a very, very basic level. But actually, I think our attitude needs to be, we need to meet that baseline, sure, but we actually need to collaborate, and we need to actually be more proactive than that if we're going to actually solve this problem.
Yeah, makes total sense. The other question I've got is, I touched on this a little bit about, how can security and user experience coexist, right? This is an important point. And I've talked about the requirement, I think, to use different tools in conjunction, but also using them smartly to, stepping up security as needed, or stepping it down when you know that the fraud risk is low. What is your perspective on this?
I think your idea that you brought up about multi-layered approach is like really key. I think that actually, I totally believe that security and customer experience can actually not only coexist, but actually enhance each other. Because I do think there's an awareness in the consumer base of fraud and of cybercrime and of scams now. I always use my mum as an example. If my mum's aware of something, it probably means it's quite well known now. Yeah. So I do think it's a factor for a lot of consumers about keeping their money safe and keeping their transactions and data safe. So I do think it is an advantage, but as you say, it's how you deploy those tools, and I think that's partially the tools you use and how you deploy them. But I think it's also about being smart at where it is. So obviously we saw that most of it happens at the transaction stage. So if you're applying it to actually meet the threat landscape and the threat intelligence that you're seeing, then I think you can do that in a more minimalist way to reduce the risk, but not overly impede upon that user experience.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm sort of looking at the Q&A now. There's a question: if resources are limited, where should businesses focus their fraud investments first? And I think that's it's going back to the survey where we have the vulnerabilities. That's where I think the fraud investments should be focused on, right? We don't have unlimited resources. Having the data helps on where to know, on knowing where to focus on your fraud investments. Another question, maybe this is for you, Lisa. How do you think fraud will change as AI tools become more widely available?
I think it's probably going to get worse. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think at the moment that like I said when I was talking, I think the jury is kind of out on whether AI is more useful for offense or defense. I don't think we've had enough exposure to it yet to know where it's best suited. I think the problem that we're going to have, and it's not a new problem actually, is that whatever we develop is going to be on some level used and abused, I suppose, by the criminals. We see this in ransomware, for example, in the cybercrime world. So one of the things that we've seen in one of the leaks from a big ransomware group, which was called Black Basta this year, actually, was that actually what they were doing was to know whether or not their cryptocurrency was clean enough to off-ramp. They actually had got hold of AML bots that we were using and that our side had developed to test that crypto against it to see if it passed the tests that we were applying to determine whether that crypto was dirty or clean. Yeah. So I think this is the problem we're going to have. And it's not a new problem because we've seen this in the malware space in cybercrime. They were always testing malware against VirusTotal to see whether or not their malware would get through, et cetera, et cetera. This is the problem that we have to solve, which I think at the moment, one part of it is this layered, multi-layered approach, like you said, Pinar, in your talk. I think the other side of it is collaboration, and it needs to be industry collaboration, but it also needs to be fraud, AML, and cyber collaboration, because we're sort of all trying to solve pieces of the same problem. So in terms of whether we think AI is going to make this better or worse, I think worse initially. But I'm hopeful that we can start to make smarter decisions and leave fewer gaps for the criminals to exploit.
Yeah, makes sense. Maybe it's just related to this. There's a question in the chat. What do you think will be the impact of proliferation of agentic AI in fraud in the future? That's an interesting point, right? Any perspectives on this?
I think in financial services world, I think it has the potential to help prevent fraud. Again, like I said before, I think it's very difficult to know at this point in time how useful it will be defensively or whether it will be more useful on the offensive side. So we'll have to see. But I think it does allow for faster sort of real-time kind of detection and response. I think it does allow for more adaptive learning, which I think can happen. So you might see, for example, lower rejection rates of transactions or things like that. So you might actually get a better user experience out of it. But again, I think it's one of these things that it's very, very new. And I think historically, when we've had new technology, there's been pros and cons to it that we may not be fully aware of yet. So I think in principle, it has a lot of potential, especially when we're talking about kind of financial transactions and transactions that have to happen very quickly, like card transactions and things like that. However, I am a cybersecurity professional, so I view all of these things with extreme caution before I jump on the bandwagon.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, maybe just one last question from the chat. There's a question, how can a company educate their customers to prevent them from these sophisticated fraud attacks? And maybe I'll just take a quick stab, and then Lisa, I'll turn it over to you. I mean, to me, of course, it will not be possible to prevent them to be from being the victims of these attacks. Not everyone, at least, right? But I think the important part is to share the knowledge, share what they see in the market, and in cases where they can take the prevention, for example, introducing context to the transactions at the transaction stage, or adding any technical prevention methodologies, they could do that. But of course, it's also about information outreach to their customers. What do you think, Lisa?
I think there's two things for me. I think firstly, from a psychological perspective, and I'm going to say this because it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month this year, so this month. So this is a kind of important point. I think we've learned that in order to get people to change their behavior and to learn something new, you need a couple of things. You need fear, which we don't like to talk about, but we need a level of fear to feel like a motivator for someone to think, I need to pay attention to this. And then you need to pair that with something called self-efficacy. So tools for someone to be able to take control of it. The obvious way this works is many years ago, we used to have a situation, especially in the UK, people leaving their handbags on the seats of their cars and going into the supermarket. Handbags were being stolen. So people started to say, look, you leave your handbag in the car, your car will get broken into. So put it in the boot or take it with you. I've now got a tool. I've got a way of minimizing my risk to myself. Yes. I just hide my handbag. So I think we have to approach it from that perspective. But I think the other side of it, which doesn't relate to education, but is part of the same thing, is we need to be proactive in going out, finding domains that are being used, finding things and shutting them down. And that needs to be proactive. Because as I said before, if the point at which we are detecting that fraud is happening is when it hits our perimeter, we're already in trouble.
Yeah.
We're already on the back foot. So we need to be more proactive.
Makes sense. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. So before we wrap up, I'd like to remind you that if you'd like to explore the findings in more detail, the full Battle in the Dark 2025 report is available to download. The QR code is on the screen, and we'll share it with you after the webinar as well. And thank you all for joining us. We hope that today's discussion has offered some valuable insights, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.